The Thornvale Citadel stood like a monument to power itself, its obsidian towers piercing the gray morning sky with the kind of permanence that made centuries feel temporary. Stone and iron dominated the landscape, but it was the energy that truly suffocated everything. The weight of dominance pressed into every corridor, every chamber, every shadowed corner where servants moved like ghosts that the world had long since forgotten to see. Within these walls lived hundreds of shifters and humans alike, all existing in a carefully maintained hierarchy where the servants occupied the lowest rung, so low that their names weren't even committed to memory. Most were forgotten before they'd been hired. Leora Ashvane was exceptional at being forgotten. It was a skill she'd developed over the course of 5 years, ever since she'd been delivered to Thornvale Citadel in the back of a merchant's cart, stripped of everything that had ever belonged to her. She'd learned how to move through the corridors without displacing the air. She'd learned how to keep her head down when nobles passed, how to make herself small when the Alpha King's advisors swept through the halls. She'd learned how to exist without truly existing, to breathe without taking up space, to become so invisible that even her own presence felt like a ghost, haunting someone else's life. The kitchen was her primary domain, though she rotated through the citadel, depending on where hands were needed. It was in the kitchen that she felt the safest, perhaps because the noise of pots and water and fire gave her permission to remain silent. Her auburn hair, which had once hung freely past her shoulders in waves the color of autumn copper, was now bound tightly in a braid that never came loose. She wrapped it every morning before dawn, when the first cooks were stumbling in with heavy eyes and rougher hands than the day before. Those waves had once meant something. In another life, in another world, those waves had caught sunlight and cast amber glints that made certain people smile. She didn't think about that life anymore. Her emerald eyes, the ones with the strange gold flecks that had always marked her as something unusual, were kept deliberately downcast. She learned the exact angle of her gaze that prevented people from making direct eye contact with her. Not too low, that drew attention, made people wonder if she was ill. Just enough of an angle that her eyes seemed to be looking past them, through them, at nothing at all. The gold in her eyes had faded over the years, or perhaps she'd simply trained her mind not to see the flecks anymore. It was easier to forget they existed than to live in fear of someone noticing them. Her body was slender, but deceptively strong, 5'4", with the kind of muscle definition that came from years of hauling water, carrying firewood, scrubbing stone floors on hands and knees until her palms bled, and then continued anyway. She wore the gray servant's dress that hung on her frame like camouflage, deliberately shapeless, deliberately designed to draw no eyes. The corset that held it together was tied loosely enough that she could breathe, tightly enough that it pressed against a particular spot on her left shoulder blade. That spot was where she always pressed her palm at night, when she could finally be alone in the tiny servants' quarters that she shared with 4 other women who barely acknowledged her existence. That spot was where her mark used to be. The burned scar that replaced it was ugly, pale, and twisted, the mark of a branding iron that had been held against her skin long enough to destroy everything beneath the surface. It was the kind of scar that told a story if anyone cared to look closely enough. But no one did. She was careful, in her bathing and dressing, to ensure that her shoulder was never exposed. The few times servants had glimpsed it, they'd asked no questions. Fear had a way of sealing lips in the shifter world, and the truth that she was marked, burned, destroyed, was more frightening than any mystery. Her days had taken on a rhythm so repetitive that it had begun to feel like a meditation, though a meditation born of necessity rather than spiritual intent. She woke at 4:30 every morning, pulled herself from a narrow cot that was more frame than comfort, and dressed in the darkness. The dormitory where she slept was shared with 4 other women. Marta, who snored, Sylvia, who talked in her sleep about gardens she'd never been allowed to tend, old Helena, who'd been serving in the citadel for 30 years and had learned not to notice anything, young Tess, who worked in the laundry and sometimes cried quietly into her pillow, and Kenna, who existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion that mirrored Leora's own. None of them spoke to her beyond absolute necessity. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something quieter than that, a collective decision made without words that Leora was the kind of person you simply didn't attach yourself to. There was something about her that discouraged intimacy, discouraged questions, discouraged the kind of casual friendship that made work bearable. The other servants knew better than to try. She'd watched Marta attempt it once, years ago, had seen the way Leora's silence and blank stare had gradually convinced Marta that conversation was unwelcome. Now nobody tried. The walk to the kitchens took 7 minutes. She could have walked it in her sleep and often felt like she did. The passages were cool even in summer, lined with stone that never seemed to warm regardless of the season. Other servants passed her as she moved, and they parted like water around stone. She learned to anticipate their movements, to position herself so she never had to actually request passage. It was a skill, knowing where to be so you didn't become an obstacle, knowing how to move through a space without disturbing it. The head cook's name was Master Aldous, and he was one of the few people in the citadel who treated her with something approaching consistency. Not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either. He had a way of pointing to what needed doing without raising his voice, and she had a way of understanding what he meant before the words were fully out of his mouth. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the 5 years. He would gesture, and she would move. He would leave a pot on the stove, and she would know it needed careful tending. He would glance toward the vegetable stores, and she would begin the process of gathering what was needed for the day's meals. The work itself was endless. There were always pots that needed scrubbing, surfaces that needed cleaning, vegetables that needed preparation. The kitchens fed hundreds of people daily, servants and guards and merchants and visiting dignitaries. It was work that required precision and stamina. Her hands, which had once been soft, were now covered in calluses and small burn marks from years of contact with hot metal and open flames. The skin on her palms was thick and rough, and sometimes when she was alone at night, she would look at them and barely recognize them as her own. There was a particular motion she'd perfected over the years, the way to clean the enormous stone counters that lined the kitchen walls. You moved in long, smooth strokes, using just enough pressure to remove the accumulated grime without damaging the surface. It was meditative, this motion. Her hands would fall into the pattern, and her mind would drift. Not to pleasant places, not to memories of better times, but to that place inside her that was neither fully awake nor fully asleep, where time passed without being felt. Sometimes, while she was cleaning, she would catch a reflection of herself in the polished metal of a pot or a pan. In these brief glimpses, she would look away quickly. She couldn't bear to see the face that looked back at her, the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, the way her hair had begun to show the first threads of gray, though she was only 27. The reflection of what she'd become was something she preferred not to acknowledge. At night, when she was finally alone in her narrow cot, she would sleep with her face turned toward the wall so no one could see if tears came. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, she would feel it, that tiny spark deep in her chest, that ember that refused to fully extinguish despite everything that had been done to smother it. Her wolf, still there, still trapped, still waiting behind walls that had been burned into place and reinforced over 5 long years. She would reach back and press her palm against her shoulder blade, against the scar tissue there, and she would try to communicate with the consciousness that lived behind the burn. "Are you still there?" She would think it, never daring to say it aloud. And sometimes, so faintly that she could barely hear it, she would feel something like the echo of a whimper, like a creature deep underground, reaching toward a light it could no longer quite see. The connection was there, but it was dying, or at least that's what she told herself. It was easier to believe her wolf was dying than to hold on to hope that it might someday wake. The scar was the symbol of what they'd done to her, the physical representation of the night her entire world had collapsed like a house of cards built on sand. She'd been 22 years old when it happened, not so different in years from who she was now, but entirely different in every way that mattered. She'd been living in the Shadow Vale Pack territory, nestled in the mountains, where the mist never fully cleared, and the trees grew so thick that sunlight had to fight to reach the forest floor. It was a pack of moderate size and considerable cruelty, ruled by an alpha who believed that strength came from the terror in his followers' eyes. She'd known something was wrong when they'd summoned her to the assembly hall at midday. Shifters didn't gather during daylight without reason. The assembly hall was a vast chamber with a soaring ceiling carved to resemble the night sky, studded with mirrors that caught even the smallest gleams of light and magnified them. When sunlight came through the high windows, it created a peculiar effect. It looked as though stars were falling directly through the ceiling. She'd always found it beautiful in a place that held very little beauty, but there had been nothing beautiful about the faces that surrounded her that day. There had been nothing beautiful about the way they'd formed a circle, or the way Alpha Ronan Silverthorn's eyes had gleamed with something that went beyond anger. It was the kind of look she'd seen in predators that had backed their prey into corners, that terrible, inevitable expression of hunger about to be satisfied. She'd been told to shift. It was a command given with absolute authority, the kind of command that a wolf obeyed without question because disobedience meant pain. So she'd let her wolf rise, had felt the familiar stretching of bone and the burning flood of magic that transformed her human form into something wild and ancient. She'd always been proud of her wolf. It was silver gray, rare in coloring, with eyes that burned like molten gold. The coat was thick and luxurious, unmarred except for the wolf mark that pulsed across her shoulder, a mystical brand that appeared on all true shifters, a mark that was born at the moment a shifter's wolf first awakened. It was unique to each shifter, as individual as a fingerprint, a glowing symbol that proved bloodline and power and legitimacy. And they'd all seen it. They'd all recognized it for what it was. Silverborn. That was what they'd called her. The word landing like a curse. Silverborn shifters were rare, almost mythological. They carried in their blood a version of the silver that poisoned most wolves. But in their case, the silver became a part of their magic, transformed it into something extraordinarily powerful. Silverborn were healers. They were protectors. They were meant to serve as anchors for their packs, sources of ancient strength and wisdom. In a pack ruled by tyranny and fear, the emergence of a Silverborn was a threat that couldn't be ignored. She'd tried to run. They'd expected her to. The hunt had been quick. She was alone, surrounded by dozens of hunters who trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. Within minutes, she'd been tackled, transformed back to human form against her will through sheer force and pain. They'd held her down against the cold stone floor. They'd brought out the branding iron. The ceremony had been deliberate. That was the part that had haunted her most over the years. The methodical, almost ritualistic nature of what they'd done. Alpha Ronin hadn't acted in a fit of rage, though rage had certainly been present. Instead, he'd orchestrated everything with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. The elders had been summoned. The pack members had been gathered. The decision had been made in those moments, after she'd revealed what she was, and the execution of that decision had been treated as a necessity, a responsibility, a duty that fell to the ones in power. They'd held her spread eagle against the cold stone floor of the assembly hall, the very same floor where she'd been commanded to shift. 4 warriors, one at each limb, holding her down with their full body weight. She'd struggled. Of course she'd struggled. But the fight had been bred out of her in those first moments of surprise, those crucial seconds where she'd realized that no one was coming to her aid, that no one in the pack possessed the kind of power to stand against this. Alpha Ronin had knelt beside her head, had looked her directly in the eyes, and had spoken words that she'd spend 5 years trying to forget. Silverborn are an aberration, an accident of nature that creates imbalance in the natural order. You could have been valuable, but instead you're a threat. You could have strengthened this pack, but instead your very existence would weaken my authority. Therefore, we remove the threat. We remove what makes you what you are. We remove your ability to ever be a danger to us again. The elders had watched in silence. Some had looked away, but none had protested. In a pack structured on absolute hierarchy, protocol, and obedience, protest was a suicide mission. So they'd stood in witness, their silence carrying the weight of collective judgment. The branding iron had been heating in a ceremonial brazier near the center of the chamber. She'd watched the other warriors carry it out, and she'd felt something inside her begin to fracture. Not fear. Fear came later. What came first was a kind of crystalline clarity, a moment where every part of her understood that her life as she knew it was ending, not in death, but in something that might be worse. Transformation, destruction, the systematic erasure of everything that made her what she was. They turned her over, pinned her face down against the stone. They torn open the back of her dress. She'd heard one of the younger warriors intake his breath sharply, a sound quickly suppressed. Someone was about to burn the mark off a living person, and even warriors trained in cruelty found something difficult in witnessing that. Ronan had taken the iron from the brazier himself. She'd heard the hiss of it as it was pulled from the heat, had heard the minute metallic singing of the superheated metal as it moved through the air. She'd tried not to think about what was about to happen. She'd tried to be brave. She tried to prepare herself mentally, and in doing so, she'd failed utterly. The contact had been instantaneous. There was no preamble of building pain, no gradual realization of what was happening. There was only the abrupt and total, all-consuming sensation of her own body turning against itself. The burn had immediately begun to char the surface of her skin, had begun to destroy the delicate tissue beneath. But worse, so much worse, was what it had done to the magic inside her. The wolf mark wasn't just an aesthetic symbol. It was a magical brand that connected her human consciousness to her wolf consciousness, that allowed the two states to exist in harmony within her body. The burning iron, combined with the ancient curse that had been woven into its creation, had been designed specifically to sever that connection. As the iron seared her flesh, the magic that lived in the mark had been methodically destroyed, pulled apart thread by thread, connection by connection. She'd felt her wolf scream. The sound had been internal, had originated from the deepest part of her consciousness, a howl of betrayal and agony that no human throat could have produced. Her wolf had been trapped in that moment between human and animal, unable to fully shift, unable to protect itself, able only to feel as its fundamental connection to her was methodically destroyed. The emotional devastation had been as profound as the physical pain, and in some ways, far more damaging. She'd screamed as well, though she barely remembered doing it. The sound had been torn from her, had echoed through the assembly hall, had mixed with the sizzle of burning flesh and the small, horrible crackles as the superheated iron destroyed living tissue. Someone had told her afterward that her screams had been so loud that they'd been heard in the courtyard outside, that servants working in the outer chambers had heard it and known something terrible was happening, even if they couldn't know exactly what. The iron had been held in place until the curse word was fully activated, until the magical severing was complete. Probably only seconds had passed, though to her it had felt like years compressed into those moments. And then it was done. The iron was removed. The damage was complete. The mark was gone, and the connection to her wolf was shattered. They'd released her, and she'd collapsed against the stone floor, her entire body shaking with shock and pain and the horrifying realization that she was no longer whole. Her wolf was still there, was still alive, but it was separated from her now, locked behind a barrier that she couldn't breach. She could feel it there, thrashing and screaming and trapped, but she couldn't reach it. She couldn't comfort it. She couldn't ease its suffering. She was isolated in her own body, cut off from the part of herself that made her complete. They'd bound her wounds, not gently. One of the healers had simply wrapped her shoulder in cloth to stop the bleeding, and that had been the extent of the care she'd received. She'd been left alone in a cell below the pack houses to recover, without company, without comfort, without any indication of what came next. She'd spent 3 days there, drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to access her wolf's presence enough to know if it was still alive or if it had finally died under the weight of the pain. On the fourth day, they'd come for her. The merchant convoy that had been passing through Pact territory had been redirected slightly off their route. A deal had been struck. She'd been sold for 12 silver coins, the irony of which hadn't escaped her even in her state of shock and trauma. 12 silver coins, the word itself reflecting the nature of her blood. Silver coins for a silverborn. The cosmic cruelty of that exchange had struck her with such force that she'd almost laughed, a sound that had come out as a broken sobbing instead. She'd been loaded into a merchant's wagon alongside bolts of cloth and preserved foods, her hands bound behind her back, though she'd been too weak and traumatized to present any real threat of escape. She'd been declared a human orphan with no pack affiliation, a girl with a background so thoroughly scrubbed clean that no one could have proven otherwise. The merchants hadn't cared about her story. They'd cared that she could work, that she'd been sold cheaply, that no one would come looking for her. As the wagon had begun to move, bearing her away from everything she'd ever known, she'd felt her wolf one last time, not as a clear communication, but as a presence, a consciousness trapped behind walls of burned scar tissue, howling silently into the void, already beginning to accept that it might never touch the sunlight again. She'd wanted to promise that things would get better, that this was temporary, that someday they would be whole again. But she'd known with a certainty that had only deepened over the following 5 years that she was making promises she had no way of keeping. The scar was the symbol of what they'd done to her, the physical representation of the night her entire world had collapsed like a house of cards built on sand. She'd been 22 years old when it happened, not so different in years from who she was now, but entirely different in every way that mattered. She'd been living in the Shadow Vale Pact territory, nestled in the mountains where the mist never fully cleared and the trees grew so thick that sunlight had to fight to reach the forest floor. It was a pack of moderate size and considerable cruelty, ruled by an alpha who believed that strength came from the terror in his followers' eyes. That had been 5 years ago. She'd been passed from household to household, used as a servant because she was cheap labor, and nobody questioned why a girl would work for almost nothing. She'd learned to cook, to clean, to repair, to disappear. She'd learned not to dream. And when she'd finally ended up at the Thornvale Citadel, assigned to the kitchens and dormitories where the lowest servants lived, she'd simply continued as she had been, invisible, forgotten, existing at the very margins of the world. Her wolf was still trapped. It would sometimes stir in her chest, especially at night when the citadel was quiet and she was alone in her cot. She could feel it there, a dormant presence that felt almost like another consciousness, almost like another self. But the burn had created a wall between them, a scar that prevented her from fully connecting with the beast inside. She could hear its voice sometimes, very faintly, like someone calling to her from the other side of a closed door. But the door remained locked, and she'd stopped trying the handle years ago. She existed in a kind of half state, neither fully human nor fully wolf, and the strange purgatory had become so familiar that she could barely remember what it felt like to be whole. The work had become her entire world. She woke before dawn to prepare bread and porridge for the hundreds of servants who needed feeding, before the household proper awakened. She scrubbed pots until her hands were raw. She hauled water from the wells that served the citadel. She mended clothes. She did whatever was asked of her and asked for nothing in return. The other servants barely spoke to her, and she didn't speak to them. It was safer that way. The Thornvale Citadel itself was ruled by Alpha King Cale Thornwood, though he was rarely present for more than a few weeks at a time. The stories about him were the kind that people told in whispers, the kind that made even the highest-ranking wolves nervous. He was massive, 6'3", with a frame that seemed carved from pure muscle and carved from dark intentions. His hair was black, long enough that it brushed his shoulders, and his eyes were steel gray until his wolf rose, at which point they began to glow with an amber gold light that seemed to burn from within. He'd inherited the title of Alpha King from his father, had expanded his territory through a combination of strategy and ruthless force, and had developed a reputation as the most powerful shifter in the known regions. The servants both feared and revered him, though they were careful never to let the reverence show when any superior might notice. He'd been away on campaign for nearly 3 years when Leora first heard his name spoken with genuine urgency. The autumn had turned particularly cold, the kind of cold that made even the thick stone walls of the citadel seem fragile. The kitchens had been working around the clock to prepare for his return. His appearance in the citadel was cause for celebration among the upper ranks, though it meant additional work for the servants. Meals needed to be more elaborate. Chambers needed to be prepared. Supplies needed to be purchased and stored. The ordinary rhythm of the citadel was upended in favor of readiness. Leora had moved through all of it with her usual efficiency. She'd helped prepare rooms that she would never see the inside of. She'd carried supplies to chambers where lords and ladies would gather. She'd done her work as she always did, with quiet competence and the kind of invisibility that allowed her to observe without being observed. It was through her work that she'd learned the layout of the entire citadel, the schedules of the major players, the secret routes that servants used to move through the spaces without encountering the people who lived in them. 3 days after the messenger had come to announce the Alpha King's approach, he'd arrived. There had been a grand gathering in the main courtyard. She'd glimpsed it from the kitchen windows as she carried baskets of vegetables. Riders had come through the gates, weapons gleaming, horses stomping and snorting clouds into the cold autumn air. The energy of the citadel had shifted immediately, becoming electric and sharp. Servants had moved faster. Guards had stood straighter. The very air had seemed to thicken with the weight of his presence, as though just his proximity demanded reverence and respect. She'd gone back to her work. She'd peeled vegetables and stirred soups, and tried not to think about the fact that the most powerful shifter in existence was now within the same walls as her. It was on the second day after his arrival that everything changed, though she didn't know it at the time. It seemed like an ordinary day in the servants' corridors. She'd been carrying fresh linens from the laundry room to the upper chambers. The routes she took were well-worn paths through the back passages, designed specifically to keep servant traffic separate from the noble residence. She was carrying a basket of folded linens, her eyes downcast in the way that had become so habitual she could walk through the citadel half asleep. She'd heard the footsteps before she realized the passage had become occupied. Heavy, purposeful, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested whoever was walking didn't expect to encounter obstacles. Instinct had made her flatten herself against the wall, trying to become even smaller, trying to make herself less of an obstruction. The passage was narrow enough that two people could barely pass if they were trying. In the moment before he appeared, she'd been preparing to lower her eyes even further, to present the absolute minimum of her presence. And then he was there. The Alpha King moved through the passage like he owned it because he did. He was even larger in person than his reputation had suggested. His shoulders broad enough that he had to tilt slightly to navigate the narrowness of the servant corridor. He was wearing dark, practical clothes designed for travel, and his long black hair was loose, falling past his shoulders like a cloak. But it was his eyes that struck her first, even though she didn't dare look directly at them. Steel gray eyes that she could feel landing on her, despite the fact that she was keeping her gaze fixed firmly on the linens in her basket. She could smell him. It was a scent so overwhelming and so profound that it seemed to knock the breath from her lungs. Wolf, powerful wolf, the scent of an alpha who ruled through absolute dominance and ancient strength. But underneath that, something else, something that smelled like forests that had never been touched by human hands, something that smelled like the kind of earth that lived beneath the reach of civilization. And underneath all of that, something that reached toward her with invisible fingers and pulled. She felt her wolf stir, actually stir. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the dormant presence in her chest, suddenly alert, suddenly awake, suddenly aware of something in the world that mattered. The sensation was so startling that she nearly dropped the linens. She gripped the basket harder, trying to ground herself, trying to maintain the invisibility that had kept her safe for so long. He'd stopped moving. She could feel the weight of his attention, like a physical force, like something pressing down on her shoulders. A moment of silence stretched between them, and in that moment, she became acutely aware of everything about her appearance: the faded gray dress, the tightly bound hair, the careful arrangement of invisibility that she'd spent years perfecting. She waited for him to move past her, waited for him to continue his journey. Servants were beneath the notice of alphas, but he didn't move. Instead, he stood there, perfectly still, and she could feel him breathing in, actually breathing in, drawing her scent into his lungs, the way a hunter identifies prey, the way a wolf recognizes something that belongs to its territory. The moment stretched, became taut with an intensity that frightened her more than anything she'd experienced since the day of the burning. Something in her body wanted to run. Something in her body wanted to look at him directly. Something in her body was responding to his presence in a way that violated every rule she'd learned about safety. The silence became unbearable. She did the only thing she could think to do. She moved further against the wall, trying to open the passage wider, trying to make it easier for him to pass. The movement was so slight that it barely qualified as movement at all. He should have simply continued walking. The passage was clear enough for him to move through without any difficulty. Instead, his voice fell like thunder in the narrow space. "What are you?" The question was strange, personal, demanding. It wasn't a greeting. It was an interrogation. It was the kind of question that presumed the right to an honest answer, that assumed authority that was absolute and unquestionable. She kept her eyes down. She was trembling slightly, and she tried to hide it by keeping her hands very still on the basket. When she managed to find her voice, it came out barely louder than a whisper. "A servant, my lord." He was quiet for a long moment, and she became hyper-aware of how close he was. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the depth of his scent more clearly now. There was something else in it, something that her wolf recognized even if her human mind couldn't quite grasp what it was. There was ash. There was something ancient. There was something that smelled like a catastrophe carefully hidden beneath time and deliberate forgetting. There was something that smelled like silver. Her wolf howled deep in her chest where no one could hear it. The sound was silent but utterly profound, a call of recognition and need and terrible, aching longing. She felt her knees want to buckle. She felt the careful walls she'd built around her own awareness want to crumble. She was terrified. She was so terrified that her hands shook harder and the linens rattled softly in the basket. "You're lying." The words were spoken with absolute certainty, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. He could smell her fear, and more than that, he could smell something beneath the fear. He could smell what they'd spent 5 years trying to bury. He could smell what the burn had been designed to erase. He could smell the wolf that lived in her bones, the silver-born magic that lived in her blood, the ancient power that no branding iron could completely destroy. She forced herself to not react. She forced herself to continue breathing normally, to keep her hands steady, to maintain the careful facade of invisibility. He was an alpha. Alphas took what they wanted. Alphas demanded answers. The safest thing was to continue denying, continue pretending, continue hiding. But her wolf wasn't interested in safety anymore. Her wolf was interested in him. Her wolf was screaming at her from behind the walls of the burn scar, demanding to know who he was, demanding to know why her body was reacting to his presence like he was the most important thing that had ever existed. The sensation was so disorienting that she felt like she was drowning in her own body. A long moment passed. She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Finally, he moved, not past her, but toward her. He reached out, and before she could process what was happening, he was brushing her hair away from her neck. His fingers were careful, almost gentle, and the touch sent electricity through her entire nervous system. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to run. She wanted to look at him directly and find out what was happening. She did none of these things. Instead, she felt his fingers trace across her neck and then move to her shoulder. He was still behind her, still close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, still close enough that his scent filled her entire world. His fingers found the edge of her dress and moved it aside just slightly, just enough to expose the top of the burn scar that lived on her shoulder blade. His entire body went rigid. The silence that followed was different from before. It was heavier. It was charged with something that felt like controlled fury, like absolute rage held back by the thinnest of threads. She could feel it radiating off him in waves, and she became acutely aware that she was alone in a narrow passage with the most powerful shifter in existence, and that he had just discovered something about her that she'd spent 5 years keeping hidden. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet, Who did this to you? She was shaking now, couldn't hide it anymore. She didn't answer because she didn't trust what would come out of her mouth. She didn't answer because the question carried an implicit threat toward anyone who had ever hurt her, and she wasn't sure she wanted to face what that threat implied. He moved away from her, and the absence of his warmth felt like a physical shock. She heard him moving back down the passage, heard his footsteps echoing away, and she waited until the sound of him had completely disappeared before she allowed herself to breathe properly again. Her legs felt weak. Her entire body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency that might shake her apart. Her wolf was still screaming, still demanding answers, still trying to break through the walls that the burn had created. She finished her delivery of linens with trembling hands. She managed to complete her shift in the kitchens, though she had no memory of what she'd done or how she'd done it. Her mind was entirely fractured, caught between the present moment and the weight of what had happened in that passage. He'd smelled the burn. He'd smelled what they'd tried to erase, and he'd asked who had done it, not like he was curious, but like he was already planning exactly what he was going to do to the people responsible. The investigation began the next morning, though she didn't know about it until the afternoon when the steward of the servants' quarters came looking for her. Leora's heart had dropped into her stomach the moment she saw his face. Being summoned by the steward meant trouble, meant she'd done something wrong, meant she was about to be dismissed and cast out into a world that had no place for her. But instead of being reprimanded, she'd been taken to a small study and left alone to wait. In the hours after his encounter with Leora, Kyle had set in motion the full force of his investigative apparatus. His spy master, a woman named Cassida, who'd been serving him for 15 years, had been given explicit instructions. Find everything, track the merchant routes, find the names and records of the merchants who'd passed through Pack territories 5 years ago. Find documentation of the sale. Find the girl's origin. Find the name of the pack that had done this. Cassida had worked with methodical precision. She'd accessed the Merchant Guild records, had traced shipping manifests, had interviewed merchants who'd since retired from the roads. It had taken her only 2 days to narrow down the convoy. It had taken her 1 more day to identify the merchant who'd made the purchase, a man named Turvin Blackheart, who'd since established himself as a general trading agent in the northern cities. Cale himself had gone to interrogate Turvin. He'd walked into the man's trading house with the kind of casual authority that made it clear this wasn't a social visit. Turvin had taken 1 look at the Alpha King's face, and all the color had drained from his own. The interrogation hadn't taken long. Turvin had been terrified, had immediately provided documentation of the sale, had handed over correspondence that identified the Shadow Veil pack as the source of the purchase. But it was one detail that had made Cale's wolf rise and barely settle again. The sale price, 12 silver coins, as if somehow the universe had decided to embed a cosmic joke into this cruelty. 12 silver coins for a silverborn. The merchant hadn't even understood the significance of what he was selling. He'd seen a girl, a nobody, something cheap. He'd had no idea that the silver in her blood was worth infinitely more than the silver he'd been paid. With the Shadow Veil pack identified, Cale's network had expanded. He'd sent agents to question the merchants who traveled that route, to interview people who'd been in the pack territory at the time of the sale, pieces of the puzzle had begun to fall into place. A girl had been brought to the assembly hall. A girl had been commanded to shift. A girl's wolf mark had been revealed to be Silverborn, and that revelation had immediately triggered action from the Alpha. The picture that emerged was horrifying in its clarity. The Alpha, Ronan Silverthorn, a name that Cale now knew with the kind of intense focus that preceded violence, had seen the girl's power as a threat to his authority. Rather than recognize the gift of a Silverborn, rather than understand what her presence could mean for pack strength, he'd chosen to destroy her, had chosen to burn away her connection to her wolf, had chosen to sell her into servitude rather than acknowledge her existence. Kyle's wolf was pacing inside him, barely contained. His human consciousness was trying to maintain the analytical distance necessary to plan the response. But his wolf was far more interested in immediate, visceral justice. The urge to ride to Shadowvale territory and destroy Ronan himself was overwhelming, was something he had to actively suppress every moment of every day. Instead, he channeled the fury into preparation. He'd summoned his council, had explained the situation, had invoked ancient laws that protected Silverborn from exactly this kind of persecution. The laws were clear. The burning of a shifter's mark without consent was a crime against the species itself. The sale of a shifter into human servitude without disclosure was grounds for immediate action. The attempted erasure of a Silverborn's identity was one of the most serious violations within shifter law. His advisors had presented him with options. He could declare war on the Shadowvale Pack. He could strip Ronan of his title through council vote. He could invoke the ancient right of trial by combat. But Cale had something else in mind, something that would be far more devastating to Ronan than any of these conventional responses. He'd sent a formal summons to Ronan's territory, couched in language that gave nothing away. The Alpha King requested the presence of the Shadowvale Pack Alpha for matters of territorial governance and international law. It was a summons that couldn't be refused without declaring open war. Ronan would have to come, and when he arrived, he would find himself facing something he'd never anticipated. The summons had been sent 3 days ago. Cassida had reported that Ronan was preparing his entourage, was gathering high-ranking wolves to accompany him, was clearly nervous about the summons, but trying to hide it. Ronan didn't know why he was being summoned. He probably thought it was about territorial boundaries or trade agreements or some other mundane matter of pack governance. He had no idea that he was walking directly into his own reckoning. While waiting for Ronan's arrival, Kyle had done something even more important. He'd begun the work of helping the girl heal. Not physically. Her burns would fade in time, though the scarring would never completely disappear. But spiritually, magically, the damage that had been done to her required undoing. And that was work that only he could do. Work that required him to be in her presence. Work that required him to guide her wolf back from the edge of extinction. The steward had looked nervous when Cale had appeared in the study where she was waiting. Servants didn't typically spend time with the Alpha King unless something significant was happening. But Cale had dismissed the steward with a gesture, and then there had been just the two of them. Leora on one side of a wooden desk, Cale on the other, and a truth hanging between them that neither of them could deny any longer. The investigation had uncovered everything, but more importantly, Cale's presence in her life had begun to trigger something within her that she'd thought was dead. The first signs were subtle. A few nights after their encounter in the passage, when she was lying in her narrow cot trying to sleep, she'd felt something like warmth in her chest. Not the usual dormant coldness of her trapped wolf, but actual heat. It had confused her, had frightened her, had made her sit up and press her palm against her chest, trying to understand what was happening. The warmth hadn't lasted long. It had faded after a few seconds, leaving her alone with her racing heart and a sense of something shifting inside her that she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was nothing, a dream, a trick of her exhausted mind. She'd gone back to sleep and tried to forget about it, but then it happened again and again. Every time she caught a glimpse of Kyle in the Citadel, a flash of him walking past the kitchens, the echo of his voice carrying through the corridors, she would feel that warmth. It started in her chest and would radiate outward, reaching to her fingertips and down into her legs. It was subtle but unmistakable, and it terrified her. The first time her eyes had flashed gold, she'd been alone in the scullery room, scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot. The gold flash had lasted only a fraction of a second, had been too quick for anyone else to possibly see, but she'd felt it. She'd felt her eyes shift, felt the wolf sight surge through her vision, had seen the scullery room suddenly revealed in shades and textures that her human eyes couldn't perceive. The sensation had been so disorienting that she'd dropped the pot, had let it cling loudly against the stone floor, had looked around frantically to make sure no one had seen. She'd been hyper-aware of that shift for days afterward, afraid that it would happen again, afraid that someone would notice. She'd started avoiding the other servants even more than usual, had kept her gaze even more carefully downcast, had spent entire shifts with her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for it to happen again. And then, one night, when she was finally alone in her cot, she'd had the most vivid dream. She'd been running through a forest, not the forest she remembered from her pack days, but something older, something more primal. The ground had been soft beneath her paws. The air had been thick with scent. She'd been fully wolf, fully herself, fully alive in a way she couldn't remember ever being. In the dream, she'd been running toward something, toward someone. She'd been racing through the trees, her heart pounding with joy and recognition. And there had been another wolf ahead of her, massive, black as midnight, with eyes that burned with amber light. She'd woken up crying. It had been the first time in 5 years that she'd dreamed of being a wolf. In 5 years of trapped consciousness, of dormant power, she'd trained her mind not to even imagine what it would be like to shift, to run, to be whole. But the dream had bypassed all of her careful defenses, had shown her what she'd been missing, had awakened something inside her that she couldn't put back to sleep. The realization had hit her like a physical blow. The ember wasn't dead. It wasn't dying. It had been waiting. All this time, through 5 years of suppression and pain and deliberate denial, her wolf had been waiting for something, waiting for someone, and that someone had finally arrived. The night after the dream, Kale had come to her. He'd found her in the kitchens after everyone else had left, had approached her with the kind of careful movements that suggested he understood how fragile she was right now. He'd placed his hand on her shoulder, not on the burn scar, but on her other shoulder, on undamaged skin, and he'd looked at her with an intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through to the consciousness that lived behind her eyes. She'd felt it then. The gold flash had been stronger this time, had lasted longer, and instead of fear, what she'd felt was recognition. Her wolf knew him. Her wolf had been reaching for him across the walls of the burn scar, had been calling to him in the language that existed below words and consciousness. Her wolf knew what her human mind had just begun to understand. "Your wolf is waking up," he'd said, his voice gentle but certain. "I can feel it. The bond between us is pulling it back from wherever you've been hiding it. It's going to be painful at first. The burn created barriers that won't come down easily, but I'm going to help you break them down." He'd taken her to the private courtyard that very night. It was a place where servants rarely went, a place hidden from the view of most of the citadel. The moon had been nearly full, and its light had turned everything silver. He'd explained what was about to happen, had warned her that trying to shift would hurt, had promised her that the pain would eventually fade. The first attempt had nearly broken her. When she tried to let her wolf rise, the pain had been immediate and overwhelming. It had felt like trying to move a limb that had been sleeping, except the limb had been asleep for 5 years, and the returning sensation was agony. She'd made it halfway through the shift before she'd collapsed, her body twisted between human and wolf, caught in the worst of both forms. Kyle had been there to catch her, had been there to guide her back to full human form, had held her while she shook and cried in his arms. They tried again the next night, and the night after that. Each attempt was marginally easier than the one before. Kyle was there for all of it, was guiding her through, was teaching her how to navigate the space between her human consciousness and her wolf consciousness. Slowly, the barriers began to weaken. The pain began to recede. The connection that had been severed was beginning to knit back together. One night, nearly 2 weeks after she'd first felt that warmth in her chest, she'd managed a partial shift that had lasted for several minutes. Her hands had transformed into claws. Her wolf senses had flooded through her. She'd felt the earth beneath her feet, had heard the night sounds of the citadel with an intensity that human ears couldn't perceive. And in that moment, connected fully to her wolf consciousness, for the first time in 5 years, she'd felt joy so profound that it had overwhelmed her. The burn scar had begun to change around that time as well. The twisted, angry tissue was gradually taking on a different quality. The edges were becoming less jagged. There was a faint metallic sheen to it, silver, the precious metal that existed in her blood beginning to reassert itself. It was like her body was remembering what it was supposed to be, was slowly healing itself through a process that had nothing to do with conventional medicine and everything to do with her own innate power reasserting control. The other servants had begun to notice something was different about her. She stood straighter now. Her eyes held more light. She moved through the kitchens with less invisibility and more presence. Master Aldous had even commented on it, a brief nod that suggested approval, the first kind gesture she'd received from him in years. She'd never been fully alone with Kyle in those weeks, but she'd felt him with her in every moment. Their connection had been growing stronger, fed by the mate bond that lived beneath her conscious awareness. When they passed in the corridors, she'd feel his attention like a warm hand on her back. When she woke in the morning, she'd sense that he'd been thinking of her during the night. They were becoming linked in ways that went beyond the physical, were being woven together at a level that transcended human understanding. And she'd stopped being afraid. The investigation had continued in the background, had culminated in the sending of a formal summons. Kyle hadn't told her all the details, but she'd pieced together enough to understand that something was coming, that reckoning was arriving. And when it came, she realized she wouldn't have to face it alone. The next day, she was brought to a formal assembly hall, not the one from the Shadow Veil Pack with the false stars, but the actual hall of the Alpha King, a space carved entirely from black stone that seemed to absorb light and sound. It was a chamber designed for declarations of power, for the kinds of announcements that changed the balance of territories. Kyle stood at the far end of the hall, and beside him, to his right, was a position that had been left deliberately empty. She was escorted to that position and told to stand there. And the moment she understood what that meant, that he was positioning her as his chosen mate, as someone of official importance, as someone who mattered, her legs almost gave out. Alpha Ronan arrived with an entourage of warriors, and even in this hall, in the presence of a power infinitely greater than his own, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he couldn't be touched. His eyes found her immediately, and she watched recognition flicker across his face. Shock, then calculation, then something that might have been fear. Though he was clearly trying to hide it, he approached Kyle directly, trying to establish dominance through posture and presence. But Kyle was taller, broader, and carried with him the weight of absolute authority. The Alpha King rose slightly, just enough to show he wasn't impressed, and then he began to speak. His words were clipped and precise, the language formal and steeped in ancient law. You bear responsibility for the burning of a Silverborn. You bear responsibility for the illegal sale of a shifter into human servitude. You bear responsibility for the attempted erasure of a marked member of our kind. Ronan's face had gone pale. He was clearly trying to figure out how this information had reached the Alpha King, was calculating the odds of escape or negotiation, but there was nowhere for him to escape to. He was in the territory of someone infinitely more powerful, and the violation he'd committed was among the most serious that one pack leader could visit upon another. His warriors shifted nervously beside him, clearly sensing that this was not a conventional diplomatic meeting. The Shadow Veil Pack had come expecting a discussion of treaties or territorial boundaries, but instead they'd walked directly into a tribunal. Ronan tried to recover, tried to maintain some semblance of authority. That matter was dealt with internally, he said, his voice carrying a false confidence that fooled no one. The girl was a threat to pack stability. The decision was made by council vote. There's no crime in maintaining internal discipline. There is a crime, Kyle interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that made everyone in the hall tense, when that discipline involves the burning of a marked shifter without cause, when it involves the illegal sale of a pack member into servitude, when it involves the attempted erasure of a Silverborn. Ronan's jaw clenched. He was looking around at his warriors, trying to gauge whether they were going to stand with him or flee. The problem was that even his most loyal warriors understood that this situation was beyond salvaging. The Alpha King had spoken. The ancient laws had been invoked. There was no defense against this. The girl is nobody, Ronan said, desperation creeping into his voice. A servant in your household. Surely such a matter is beneath the concern of... Look at her, Kale said quietly. Ronan's eyes shifted to Leora, and she watched his face as he finally began to understand what was happening. He was seeing her standing at the position of honor. He was seeing her standing beside the Alpha King. He was understanding, with the kind of clarity that preceded panic, that she was no longer the powerless girl he'd burned 5 years ago. Kale continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ancient ritual. The Silverborn in question is under my protection. As of this moment, she is declared my chosen mate and is hereby granted the full protection and authority that accompanies such status. The words landed like a hammer in the hall. Ronan's face went from pale to gray. His warriors actually took a step backward, understanding now that this was far more serious than any of them had anticipated. A mate of the Alpha King was untouchable. A Silverborn mate was infinitely more than that. Kyle turned to look at her, and the moment his eyes met hers, she felt the mate bond lock into place with a sensation that was almost physical. It was like a key turning in a lock, like two halves of something finally becoming whole. Her wolf howled, and this time the sound was real, loud enough that everyone in the chamber heard it echoing off the stone walls. And as her wolf's voice filled the space, she felt something else happening. The burned scar on her shoulder blade began to heat, began to pulse with a light that was golden and silver all at once. She gasped as the sensation reached its peak, and then the scar began to change. The twisted, angry tissue was being replaced by something new, a wolf mark that was being regenerated through her own silver blood, a mark that glowed with an ethereal light that was entirely unique. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever felt. When the light faded, the mark was complete. She was whole. Her wolf was free. Her identity was restored. Kale's voice became colder, more terrible. As for you, Ronan Silverthorn, the crimes you have committed are without excuse and without mercy. The burning of a marked shifter, the illegal sale of a pack member, the attempted destruction of a Silverborn. These are violations that transcend territorial law and strike at the heart of what we are as a people. Ronan tried to speak, tried to mount some kind of defense, but Kyle simply raised his hand. The gesture was enough to silence him. You will formally renounce your claim on the Shadow Vale Pack territory, effective immediately. Your right to lead has been stripped from you by judgment of the Alpha King. You are exiled from every territory within my domain, which encompasses all but the furthest reaches of the southern mountains. Any pack that offers you shelter risks sharing your fate. One of the elders from the Shadow Vale Pack stepped forward. He was an old man, gray-haired, wearing the marks of someone who'd seen decades of pack politics. He looked at Ronan with something like pity. The judgment is just, the elder said, and his words seemed to carry the weight of his entire pack's acceptance. Ronan looked like he wanted to argue, but he'd already lost. Even his own people understood that he'd brought this upon himself. Furthermore, Kyle continued, his voice taking on a tone that suggested something even worse was coming. As poetic justice for your attempt to destroy a wolf mark, a crime that strikes at the very soul of who we are, your own wolf mark will be stripped. You will be cast out into the human world, unable to shift, unable to access the power that made you Alpha. You will exist as they do, limited, fragile, mortal. The silence that followed was absolute. It was worse than execution. It was a fate that most shifters considered worse than death. To be separated from your wolf, to be forced to live the rest of your life as a human, to lose everything that had made you powerful and ancient and connected to something greater than yourself. It was devastation on a level that few shifters could comprehend. Ronan fell to his knees. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The shock of his fall from power had been too absolute, too swift. He'd walked into this hall expecting to negotiate, and he was leaving it exiled and stripped of everything that made him what he was. The ceremony was brief and final. Chaol's own mark, a massive wolf mark that covered most of his upper back and glowed with ancient power, was invoked. Using magic older than any law, he placed his hand on Ronan's shoulder and burned away the marks that had defined him as Alpha. It was quick and efficient, lacking the cruelty that Ronan had shown when he'd burned Leora's mark. There was no attempt to maximize pain, no ceremony designed to humiliate. It was simply justice, swift and absolute. When it was done, Ronan was no longer a shifter. He was no longer a leader. He was simply a man, stripped of everything, facing exile and a future that would be infinitely more difficult than anything he'd ever experienced. The Shadow Veil Pact's remaining warriors watched in silence as their former alpha was escorted from the hall. Some of them looked relieved. Ronan's rule had been tyrannical and cruel. His removal would likely improve their lives. But all of them understood the magnitude of what had just happened. No one was untouchable, not even an alpha. Not when the Alpha King decided that justice had to be served. Ronan was forced to kneel before the Alpha King and formally renounce his claim on the Shadow Veil Pact territory. His right to lead was stripped from him, and he was exiled from every territory within the Alpha King's domain. The consequences were swift and absolute, and when it was finished, the only one left standing was Chaol, and beside him, finally and completely, was Leora Ashvane, silver-born mate of the Alpha King, whole and free and exactly where she was supposed to be. When they left the assembly hall, Chaol took her hand in his. She could still feel the tingle of the regenerated mark on her shoulder, could still feel her wolf's presence bright and awake in her chest. She could feel the mate bond pulsing between them, a connection that went beyond words or understanding, that simply existed as a fundamental truth of their existence. He led her not to his chambers, but to the private courtyard where he'd helped her practice shifting. In the moonlight, she could see his face clearly, and she saw in his expression something that made her understand exactly how he'd become the Alpha King. Beneath the power was something profoundly protective, profoundly devoted. His wolf had claimed her from the moment he'd smelled what they'd tried to erase, and everything that had happened since had simply been his human side catching up to what his wolf had always known. "Shift for me," he whispered. She let her wolf rise, and this time the pain was minimal, the connection smooth. Her body transformed into the silver-gray form that she'd been denied for so long, and when she opened her eyes, she could see herself reflected in his gaze. She was beautiful. She was powerful. She was finally, completely, undeniably herself. Her wolf's new mark glowed with silver light, and she howled, a sound that carried across the entire citadel, a declaration that she had been found. that she had been claimed, that she was no longer a ghost or a shadow, but a vital and essential part of the world. Kyle shifted as well, his massive black wolf form dwarfing hers, but when he moved, it was with absolute tenderness. They stood together in the moonlight, two wolves bound by something more than biology, something that transcended history and pain and all the things that had tried to separate them. And for the first time in 5 years, for the first time since the day they'd burned her mark and sold her into darkness, Leora felt whole. She felt home. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with, finally, miraculously, unmistakably free.